Okay,
Okay.
good.
So just an introduction of yourself, your background, experience, game titles, companies you possibly worked in, produced, or tested.
Okay. So good to see you, Benedict. I have been
Yeah.
in the video game business for over 30 years. Started out with Microprose software, working on flight simulators like F-15 Strike Eagle many years ago, and worked on the first Civilization product as an extra artist, and also Darklands, which was a historical role-playing game that is still played today and still accessible on Steam at $6. So some of the things that I did after that, went to Origin Systems and Electronic Arts in Austin, Texas. Worked on Wing Commander titles as well as Crusader titles, and also eventually took on Ultima Online products. Um, After that, I went into independent work, my own companies, and I, for about 18 contracts, worked on Ultima Online expansion packs with Electronic Arts, and then eventually partnered with a group of people that became Callisto USA with the Callisto Entertainment out of Bordeaux. And we worked on Jimmy Neutron and SpongeBob SquarePants for GameCube and PlayStation 2. As I mentioned, SpongeBob won Game of the Year, Kids' Choice Awards for 2003, Best Game of the Year. And then I went on to employ about 1,800 people for 14 years in my own business again, working on such titles as Trion's Rift. We did the server-side code for that, as well as the Tron Evolution multiplayer levels for Disney and Propaganda. Those are just a couple of products. We worked on over 200 games on console, PC, Mac, and mobile platforms. And since the last 6 years, I've been with Gameshastra as an executive producer and business development executive, working on products that range from Mafia 3, XCOM 2, Civilization 6, Train Sim World, War Dragons, and again, many products, about 60, 65 products in the last 6 years on mobile platforms, console, etc. Managing about 230 artists and programmers in India at this point.
Great.
So that's my resume in a few minutes. As we were talking about earlier, if I tell you about what actually happened, we would need a couple of weeks.
Great. So based on your experience, your lengthy experience, in detail, can you describe the game design process, the cycles for development for platforms of console, mobile, PC, and web?
Yes, one of the things that most game developers, especially if they're indies or smaller groups, they see the pattern or the process pipeline that big publishers use, and they say, well, that's a lot of stuff, and we're just a small group. No matter the platform, no matter the product, this pipeline spine is actually very important to follow, whether you're 2 guys or 1,000. And it starts off with pre-design. Pre-design phase, you decide, what market, what genre, what product that you want to make, what type of product, how are you going to build it, etc. To decide before you move forward, in the span of several weeks, not only what you want to make, but where you will sell it, who you will sell it to, if you can make it. These are all things that you should do in pre-design. Once you decide and you say, okay, we're now going to do an RPG or a shooter or, a mobile game or a console game, you go into a phase called concept. And in concept, you literally create the blueprint for your game from beginning to end. You talk about what is the gameplay mechanic, what is the environment of that gameplay mechanic, what it looks like, who will play it, how the user interface and user experience is set up, how many assets you're going to build, how many levels you're going to build, etc. So in that concept phase, you kind of determine the recipe for your project. Then you look at your recipe and you define the next phase, which is prototype vertical slice, where you say, what is the basic of our game? At that point, you build out a playable, a very small playable, but it has all of the elements of what you say in concept is your game. So that means if it's a battle game, you have the battle mechanic. If it's an exploration game, you have the exploration mechanic within this prototype vertical slice. Then you test that, you look at it. You may have some people talk to you about it. If you have a relationship with a publisher, they also will review that. But it's a very important phase because before you go into the next, you decide what needs to change, what isn't good enough, what maybe doesn't make sense, all in one little slice. Then the next phase, once you determine and refine that vertical slice, you now do a minimum viable product. Now, a minimum viable product, you look at if you're going to do early access on Steam, you say it needs 3 levels of playable, it needs 20 characters, it needs X assets, it needs these features. Then you say, okay, now I've got a plan where I'm going to build out the vertical slice and iterate it over 3 levels. Okay, that's the minimum viable product. Why we call it that? It means you could actually start launching it to people and then start adding to it. So it is a minimum version of your product. It means that I can go and release it on iOS and people can play it, and then I can update it or Steam access, early access, etc. The next phase, once you get minimum viable product, if you're working with a publisher, if you're working on your own, if you're releasing early access, you get feedback from users and players and other people. At that point, you refine the next phase, which is full production of your full product. And at that point, if you've planned it properly, each phase, all that should be is saying, I need 20 of this, I need 200 of this, but you shouldn't be reinventing at that point. You should just be manufacturing the content. And if you're a mobile product, you're doing updates. You know, if you're on Steam, you're doing expansion packs or DLCs to fill out the rest of your product. And then at that point, if you really are in full development, whether indie or otherwise, you go through certain phases in full production where you have an alpha, which is full feature, but not all assets. Then you get to a beta that has full feature, all assets. At that point, then you go into refinements, testing, constant testing, and you eventually get to what you term a gold master. So you either go to manufacturing or you release that product and you now have essentially a full production. So, and then you deal with the issues of what the platform needs. If you're going through a console, you have to go through a review process. You have to, send it to Sony or send it to Microsoft. You have to make, the refinements that they ask for, adjustments that they ask for. If you're using a product like Unity, it does a lot of the legwork for you in terms of the multi-platforms. You still have to go through the process with the actual platform. And that includes iOS, Android, PC, Mac. Everything needs to be refined after that Gold Master. And when I say that, most studios like mine, we include that all in the Gold Master because Gold Master means we're releasing it to the publisher. If you're indie, you should get it to Gold Master before you deal with the various platforms. Because if you're using Unity, it's just an iteration into mobile, into console, into PC, Mac. You start wherever, as an independent, you start where you're going to get the revenue. So if it's a mobile product, you go to iOS iteration of your Gold Master. At that point, you start generating revenue. And then at the, you can make the decision, do we go to console? Is it popular enough? Does it need to be updated, upgraded? So that's the cycle. And it's the same, whether it's me doing a mobile app or me being in charge of 1,000 people making a console product for a major publisher. It is essentially a variant of the spine.
Great. sounds like a very, very lengthy process and a very iterative process. Um, so I know QA is part of this process. How important is this, and what does it what does it entail in detail?
Okay, we're speaking about quality assurance at
Yes,
this
yes,
point.
yes.
Yeah, quality assurance, it starts at the beginning. When I used to work at publishers, we always had the QA lead in the team meetings from pre-concept all the way through. That person is kind of the balance to our dreams of saying what is possible, what is doable in terms of what a user base is looking for, what a genre should be. So QA is not just testing bugs and bug fixing. QA is actually almost like a customer representative. In the marketplace, et cetera, what users are looking for in terms of your game. So that as you're designing, you're constantly getting that feedback loop of refinement. Okay, so this is a little different than most organizations, but I can tell you I've worked at several developers and publishers like Electronic Arts and Microprose, where QA was in part of the process right from the beginning. And they made better products because of it. We made choices as we were designing and as we were producing that were constantly reflecting back to the user experience, the user interface, the user, what you would call the recipe of what they want to eat. What's the meal? Your product is a meal and you're looking for a lot of customers to come to your restaurant. You have to make sure that you have a master chef that's looking at it from their perspective, not just your perspective, but from that end player perspective.
Right. I've been around some of the development events for indies down here, organized with you myself. And when I talk to some indies, I get feedback on what kind of stages or development process small studios or big studios should engage in, especially with situations of lack of finance, which we experience down here. So, from your experience, should this process vary for small studios? The development cycle, I mean, should they vary for small studios and big studios, or is there a median for it?
Okay, yeah, I'm lucky at this point in time to answer this question. I have my full-time job as an executive producer and biz dev executive, but I also have a side project that is more of a passion project. There's only 3 of us on this project. There have been more over time, but our lead designer and executive producer passed away recently. His name is Arnold Hendrick. We are working on a spiritual successor to Darklands, and we are following agile rules. We're doing, weekly, actually 3 times a week Scrum. We are assigning tasks, and we are doing epics, and we're doing stories, and we're doing the whole 9 yards. There's only 3 of us. And we're following the spine of development that I mentioned earlier to the T. We're still in concept phase. We went through pre-design. We're coming to the end of concept phase. We're building out all, the conceptuals for the gameplay, for the various modules of the game. It's taken years. When you're a small group, you can't, unless you're going to change your game, because understand, this is an RPG. It's a historical RPG, so it's a big game. If you were doing a mobile title with 2 guys, you should still follow the pipeline. You should still do the phases of that spine. You should do good management, good best practices of managing. What are you going to do, Benedict? What's Matt going to do? What are we going to have by the end of the week? What are we going to do next week, right? So when you set your sprints and you set your goals, it is following this pipeline. Whether you're 1 person or, as I say, 1,000, you need to follow this process, because what happens when you don't if you just say we're making a game and you're two of you and you're just going to hack on it and you're just going to make it happen, you're going to make it happen. You give yourself a month schedule and you're going to create, some kind of running game for mobile. And you're going to run, tunnel game. You're going to run and you're going to collect items, and that's the game. And then you go and make that thing. And then you say, okay, now I want to get it on iOS. And Apple says, we already have thousands of those, and there's nothing unique about your idea. So you just wasted your month. Okay? It's very important, no matter what your scale, that you follow your rules of deciding what you want to build by evaluating what your market is. You can be very passionate about wanting to make the next Star Wars game, but guess what? You can't afford the license. You can't afford the license. So, to start out and say, in Indy, I'm going to make a Star Wars game, well, you're done already because you'll never be able to make that product.
Right.
So it's very important to do these phases and to have organized development, even when it's just you, to decide, what am I doing this week? Set your sprint, and we try to do three-week sprints. There's only three of us. We think about what one person can get done in 3 weeks. It's manageable. We can actually accomplish things, and we set story points, and we do all the analysis, and we do all the reporting. And now some people may say, oh, that's so much overhead. That's ridiculous. If you're serious about making a project, there are certain disciplines that you should go through, because guess what? You start out making your product as a single guy. You want to take on 10 more people because grandma gave you some money and you now can hire 10 people to help you do more. Well, how are they going to know what to do? You're going to waste grandma's money because you're going to give them money. You're going to say, go do these things. They're going to do things. You're going to bring it back and it won't work. So very important to stay true to best practices, no matter what your scale.
Right.
And it's platform agnostic, whatever platform you're doing.
Okay. So games and story, right? Though not all games depend on story, but we know storytelling sometimes it plays a serious major factor on the success of the game. Is there a process for early testing of story content in games, or is it just a storyboarding into games and that sort of thing? Is there a similarity with it with games and animation, a development story process?
Well, it's just like we were talking about, whatever the genre is, you have hogs where there may be some story, hidden object game leading to various things. The game mechanic is kind of wrapped in story. Then you have episode titles where it actually is a continuing episodic story. Then you might have a large RPG where, like with Elder Scrolls, there are tens of thousands of books of lore inside that world. How do you manage that? What does it do? How is it linked together? So it scales from just, John meets Alice. John and Alice now go to the mansion, something very simple, to the adventurers go out into the world and they have to find the story. So you say, okay, how am I going to lead them to the story? Then you have the story elements itself, but then you have all the mechanic to get you to story and how that's done. So story games are so varied that, the main thing that you have to do, just like with any game, is bring it down to a core mechanic. How am I telling my story? If I'm telling my story through adventuring, then that's two mechanics. I have an adventuring mechanic and I have a story mechanic. Okay, so you try to deal with them separately, where the exploration mechanic has triggers. It gets to an event, and then once you hit that event, now the story unfolds. You can test a story the same way you play an RPG, the same way you play a board game, same way you play Magic the Gathering. So how we used to do this back at MicroProse, when we were working on certain games, we would play the story. Like with Darklands, it was medieval Germany and everything that the people believed in terms of superstition was reality. And we eventually did the Book of Revelation, the apocalypse happening in Germany in the Middle Ages. And that was our story goal. But then we had to tie it into a normal RPG. How do you trigger, the Great Hunt, the Wild Hunt? How do you trigger Black Sabbath? How do you trigger these story elements? And then you kind of refine it down to the mechanic. Then you play test the mechanic. You sit at lunch. What we used to do is our lunch break, we would take the story elements of our game, and we would either create a card game or an RPG, D&D kind of game, or some other way of doing a test of the story. And we would play the game. We would actually play the story and say, does this make sense? Does this feel right? So it's very important with a story game, you work out the mechanic of how the story will be told. Once you have that, you've got all the pieces where you tell a writer, I need 200 dialogue points. I need 500 plot points where it says, okay, here's the adventure in a paragraph. Here's the information. Give me 500 paragraphs because I'm going to parse it into the game, either through menu choices, text alerts, whatever, or physical books. My player is reading the book and he gets this information. And you put that all into a matrix so that the programmers can call on that into the mechanic. So it's a very involved process, but it is the same no matter what the game. You have to test your story. Does it work? And then once you do that, just like with every other asset, you test your battle, you test your exploration, and then you build out your assets. So now you need 500 story points. You need, ridiculous, tens of thousands of lines of dialogue, depending if you're Elder Scrolls. You need literally, when you get a book of lore in Elder Scrolls, there's a lot to read. There's a lot there. Someone has to write that. So depending on the scale of your story game, if it's like episodes or choices, that's a different mechanic, and everything is kind of laid out in a recipe, a pattern, and you just fill in your spreadsheet. So John asked this question, Mary answers these answers. If Mary answers this, then John says this. It all just becomes a matrix of story. And the better story games are more procedural, where use AI, where it's context sensitive and it can kind of choose from a whole bunch of stuff what to say, when to say it, to move the story forward. So I'm not sure if that's absolutely clear to answer the question that was being asked, but there is a methodology for testing story, developing the core mechanic, and then building out the assets, just like any other type of game.
Right. Video games in general sound like a visual experience. Are there design processes for people with disabilities that vary? How do we get people with disabilities or autistic people with hard of hearing disabilities to access games? What is the usual process for them? And does it differ from the normal visual experiences?
In every product. So we have guidelines, and game accessibility guidelines.com. They kind of work through the accessibility issues, and they give recommendations on how to address it. If I were to go through that, we'd need 2 or 3 more sessions, but this is a requirement in various jurisdictions. You have to check that. You have to make sure when you're making your product and your platform choice, if they have standards, like when you're talking about Sony or Microsoft, these are clear standards that you have to meet. But they also give you support. They also give you guidelines. And if you're developing in Unity or you're developing in Unreal, you know, any kind of a blender, you know, these companies also have support to help you through accessibility guidelines. So, and the functionality that should be there. So my recommendation is, dependent on your product, you know, I don't want to necessarily go into details and say, well, it's for visually impaired or it's for hearing impaired, or, you know, you know, the interface needs to be more esoteric. You know, there are some games that are all based on eye position and time. You know, for friends of mine that had ALS, they were able to continue to work with their computer through that interface. So there are many things available. You as an independent developer do not have to rework it, do not have to rediscover it. There are opportunities to have dialogue with your publisher or with your tools manufacturer, and also our organizations, our game development organizations also have support to find out those issues you need to address. Really. I also gave you a legal brief regarding accessibility, just so people not just see the rules and guidelines, but also potential legal consequence and accessibility. But it's an extreme. I'm very gratified that this is a question. I just, you know, I think it's another whole forum in and of itself to discuss that one question and really come up with, you know, the guidance that people need. So within these two links, plus talking to Unity support, talking to Unreal support, Blender support, the software, you know, organizations, ESA and others, they all have information regarding this. So part of your pre-design phase of our development spine is looking into these things and making sure you have a whole category on accessibility, because you may make a choice on your production and say, we can't do that. You know, we need to do it in order to get published, but we need their help. So let's focus on our core mechanic, then go meet with a publisher, go meet with, you know, another developer and say, we've got this mechanic, we've got this idea, we need your support, we need your funding in order to build out all these features. It's very important for small groups to understand that it's not a barrier, but it is an obstacle. You know, it won't stop you, but it is something you will have to deal with. You will have to have some solution for your final deliverable. Otherwise, you won't get to market.
Okay. So the design process, again, another question on the design process with principles like RNG. For those who don't know what RNG, it's a random number generation and also procedurally generated design, which is also factored into game design process sometimes. What other principles exist? If there are other principles, and can you possibly give us links to them?
Yes. Yeah, one of the things that we're playing around with now in a couple of our projects is AI processing. Once you get into artificial intelligence and you know, kind of partner that with procedural, it becomes a very interesting proposition. It definitely needs some core programming capability in your team to access. But one of the things I read as we were, you know, I was briefed on this question, is there is there's a book that was published by MIT called Rules of Play. And it's by edited by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman. And what they've done is they've gone through all forms of play, and they give you a granular aspect of what the design principles are for each type of play. And they get into the theory, so it's a big book, but there are also briefs in this that will give you a description of the various, like we talked about with the spine of development, there are spines of design. There are ways of looking at gameplay design that are, founded over decades of development. So it's very important, again, very robust subject matter that needs, more information and more time to discuss. But Ralph Foster had done a talk at GDC called Theory of Fun. And he also published a book that kind of took that, what not only design principles of gameplay, but what makes it fun is very important as well. So design principles, if you're talking from a tech perspective, then Theory of Fun, and there are so many books on programming standards and things in regards to game development that I would point people to. Big library. Wish that it was more accessible in terms of documents online. GDC has a library of things. The Game Developer magazine, which is no longer, but had all of the back issues available where people have through and talk about not just, best practices, design principles, but also postmortems on products. Very important when you're looking at design principles, look at product that is similar to what you're trying to design, and then try to find out the information. What did they go through? How did they build it? Not to copy it, to learn process, to learn principles, and also contact them. With the postmortems, I still think they're available, but I'm checking on that with the board at GDC to see if that is still accessible and if you have to be a member or if it's freely accessible. Because I want your audience to have access to information. This is important. It's easy for me to say you need to do these things, but if you go up on the internet and you say, there's nothing there, it's very important to give at least access to links for this. But every one of us has internet connect, and every one of us can kind of say design principle, run, design principle on, and get the letter there and do the research. Also when you're looking at a particular product from a design perspective, SIGGRAPH is also a place, although it's primarily, computer graphics. In many cases, you'll see computer game groups, especially groups, how they did a particular mechanic. GDC has these types of talks. Other indie development conferences have these types of talks. Those notes, read through those notes. Essentially, we're still defining the library. It's not like you can go and say, okay, ancient history, I go to the library and I look up under the Dewey Decimal System and everything I need to know about ancient history is there. In game development, we're still defining it. So the journals, the Gameshastra site, Game Industry Biz site, all these various places to gather information, Metacritic reviews, which we'll talk about later. When you're looking for things, how did a product do? Go on to Steam and you look and say, oh, it's not doing too well. Why isn't it doing so well? This is the game similar to the game you want to make. What did they do wrong? That becomes your library of design principles. Okay, it isn't just relegated to the recipe. It's also how you're going to cook that recipe. What are you going to do with that information, and how are you going to change it, improve it? So this particular question that you asked, there is, again, such a volume of knowledge. And I know when you're looking at it from the outside, it's like, how do I get there? It's a big library, but there's no door. What I want to do is kind of bring that 40-story door down to first level for you, and at least give you a starting point, give your audience a starting point. Look at these books that have been published. They're available on Amazon. If you have Kindle Unlimited, I think, any kind of reader where you can get access or rent the book. I don't know, I'm checking to see if the Internet Archive has it as a borrowing book, but there's a lot of online libraries that are based on real world libraries. that you can access and should be able to get free access to this information. I don't want your audience to necessarily have to go buy the book, although the authors would love it if I were saying that. But definitely with this, it's going to take more research. I welcome a follow-up discussion where we actually prep just specifically to talk about this subject for a talk together. And I would recommend having that talk with some really good senior designers. I'd be more than willing to recommend a couple of people because you definitely you got to do the research. It isn't something that you could just go get the pamphlet and says, okay, this is how I make Pokemon Go. It definitely is something that needs to be discussed and evaluated.
All right, great. So maybe, as you mentioned, sometime in the future, we can arrange a proper, more elaborated session with more industry people to highlight some of these challenges and highlight some of these issues.
And even a discussion of the theory of fun and the rules of play. If we look at things and kind of pull out information, that would be something, if the people can't get access to those books, to do a summary review of those to give people more information. And also if just to add to this, doing a little research and doing a follow-up document that is, here are a bunch of internet sites to go to, and here's just a packet of links for people to get them started. Because once they get started going there will always be other places to look. Because when you look at an article, there's going to be the people that they looked at to create the article. You hit those links, so you'll have thousands of links of information to look for.
Right. So player reviews, you mentioned Metacritic, which also leads us to our next question. Player reviews and industry ratings, especially for games and their genres. We know Metacritic, we know ESRB, and I know a few others as well. How important are these organizations to the design process, and how does one assess, or how do they assess or rate mobile games, if you have information on that as well?
Yes. Yeah, as we talked about in the pre-design phase of your development, you should be looking at similar product and its performance. Depending on what you want to build, there are so many games that have been done, thousands and thousands of games. You may not be doing exactly the game, but you may be inspired by it. We do it all it's like the Crusader. I worked on the original Crusade game. Every review, every article, they were saying, yeah, we were looking at the Crusader game and we said, let's do a fantasy version of that, where it's a fully destructible dungeon. And it's inspiring to know that work we were doing, and we were asking EA and Origin, let us do a fantasy game. We would have done Diablo before Diablo. That comes from reviewing the Metacritic scores, reviewing the content of the reviews from players, looking at the various performance, how well did it do on a certain platform, may guide you, say, well, yeah, maybe that kind of game doesn't do so well on iOS. Maybe it does better on Android. Don't know why, but when you look at the reviews, it's obvious. Same thing when you say, I want to do a kind of game. Let's say you wanted to do a Diablo kind of game, and you looked at Crusader reviews, and you said, well, it was pretty good for a science fiction game, but will it do well as a fantasy game? Before Diablo, there was nothing to compare it to. Now you can look at all the various games that were on Diablo and say, that kind of dungeon I want to make. And you say, well, here's what's happening latest. When you look at Steam Early Access and you look at what just came out, reviews, you look at the scores, and you say, wow, there's something wrong there, because look at why, and you look at what the player said, the lag time, or say it's too much of a grind, there's not enough new content. You know, it's all the same thing iterated. Then you look at it and say, well, we only have two guys. How are we going to do 5,000 iterations so it's interesting? We're going to end up the same thing as them, or we're not going to make any sales because it's going to just be a grind. You may make a choice based on the review of the stuff on Metacritic, the review on Steam. You know, all of this should be things you do at the early stages of your development. You don't want to find out the same mistakes they made when you release your product. So that's why these reviews and scores are extremely important. And playing to the scores is not a bad thing. When you're thinking about making your game, it's a project of passion. You want to make what you want to make. You know, you want to make it because you think that you know better. Some people, you know better that that game would have been so much better if I did this with it. So I'm designing my game to be that game better. And then you don't look at the reviews, so you don't find out what was wrong with that game. So you make the same mistakes. You do your improvement, but you die on the sales because you didn't fix all the other things that were wrong with their game. You only looked at what you thought was wrong with their game. So again, information, decision-making, review, analysis of that determines your goals. So very important. Every product, since we've had these, even at MicroProse in the early days, we didn't have the websites because the internet didn't exist, but we had the magazines. We would look at the reviews in those magazines every day. Every day we were looking at those things. And when it came to our projects, we would absolutely be looking at all the various reviews, and there were known entities. You know, there were celebrity reviewers back then that were, you know, kind of the score was, so you wanted to be successful in that particular genre, you'd want to kind of have a successful review with Scorpia. It's similar today, without all of that. You know, it's not like we have as many celebrities. It's more of a question of looking at the user, the player reviews, looking at the Metacritic score and how they've evaluated the input they've gotten from players. And that research is absolutely necessary. You know, you should be looking at that all the time when you're making decisions on your product. Unless you're a savant, a genius, and you have such a vision that's going to change the world, you're safer as an independent developer, whether you're a publisher, owned developer, or an individual indie. Looking at that information, it's extremely useful in your decision making.
Okay. To our committees down here, the best practices for design process, especially across platform or genres. What are these, and please describe them in detail or elaborate on them for us, please.
Yes. Yeah, one of the things that I've done in, you know, over 30 years of development is worked on many different types of games, every platform you can think of, every production methodology. The first game I worked on was character-based, 8x8 pixel characters, and it was a green screen monitor. So it was essentially 3 colors and transparent, and 2 of those 3 colors were black. So it was essentially a green light and nothing else, but you created your world based on that. Now, when you look at Unreal version 5 coming out, and you look at Unity and its development, and Blender also doing such a wonderful job of creating such robust realities, that a part of your design process is evaluating platform, evaluating methodology. You know, what are the goals of its look? All that. There's there's so much to think about in terms of final deliverable. But best practices takes you right back to that initial spine. You go through each phase in linear fashion. You don't try to jump to the end of your development. You go through each phase of development, from pre-concept design, concept design, into your vertical slice, into your minimal viable product, full production, alpha, beta, gold master. Those are, no matter what, that is the safest route to success. If you try to bypass that, you will fail. And you won't necessarily fail because your idea is bad or that your game is bad. It's just that you get ahead of it and you start having to fix bugs as soon as you start building it because you didn't work out, well, how is this going to tie into that? What's going to happen when somebody does this? What's going to happen when that? And what tools to use to build it? What platform to build it on? What genre are we building, to make sure you don't end up with a mixed genre game that breaks itself before you get to vertical slice, before you get to minimum viable product, which means you'll never get to market. So best practices, the production spine, number one. Number two, when you're looking at each phase of that, doing it in a full fashion, professional production management. You know, you do an assignment. Even if it's just you assign yourself a task. Once you look at that task, you say, do I have all the knowledge I need to evaluate that task? If not, then you need to make a first task, find all the knowledge, do the research, then do your task. Then once your task, what's that task leading to? Do those stories so that you know why you're doing what you're doing today based on the research you did yesterday and you're set for tomorrow. Best practices are you don't just go in and start throwing food in the pot. It doesn't work that way. It will never work that way unless you are so extremely lucky that you created a chaotic game that everybody loves, where you just throw stuff into a pot and you see what cooks. You know, I've never seen that game. I've seen some games that were based on choices made, like Katamari Damacy, where they were working on a game mechanic and it suddenly became the game, or you just have this rolling snowball that keeps on grabbing everything in the environment. It's like, that wasn't the original concept. There's no way that was the original concept. That was a throw everything into the pot. Oh, that looks interesting. Let's develop that. And, you know, I'm minimizing it. Of course, it was a great thing. But when you look at the various, as the technology changes of the platform, Sony puts money into R&D, Microsoft puts money into R&D. What can we do on this platform? That's how things like Katamari Damacy come out, and Octoman. You know, what? Who would think to make that game? It had to come from something where somebody threw a couple of things together and said, well, we can't. Oh, yes, we can. We can do something with this. And they make a game. And it's a small game, but it's very intriguing, very interesting, and very influential. So if you want to be influential and you want to work from chaos, yeah, you know, maybe people that come up with that concept that builds a genre. More important that you go through the known process, you know, step by step, very managed, very focused. And it's difficult for people that haven't been trained in this method, where they think that I just start making the final game. If you're truly interested in being a commercial success with your product, these are methodologies that are well documented on the internet. You know, I took my version, my edit of it, but my edit is based on not only my own experience, but other, you know, discussions of process. Mine is not the only answer either. The only, what I would say in terms of your method, whoever is looking to do it, basing it on a spine that looks at your product from beginning to end, which means from the first time you dreamt it to when you actually deliver it to players and afterwards, because you're going to have to support it. You're going to have to think about, what do I do next? You know, I wanted to make another game. What happened with my first game? So that line of development is very important as a structural support to your work. Then your management of that process, how you manage yourself, how you manage others, how you communicate. Very important to have, you know, a methodology and tools that other people are using successfully if you want to be successful. Trello's an example of a tool that's come around that some people find easier and more straightforward to work with. Confluence and Jira, is another. Basecamp is another. Finding some way of organizing and structuring your process. So if it's just you, you still do it. If it's 10 people and we're distributed across the planet, it's even more important that you have a designated spot to discuss process, designated tasks, designated schedules. I need Benedict in Nigeria to get something done by tomorrow. Otherwise, I can't do what I need to do on Sunday. So how does he know that? How does he know what to do? How do I know what to do? It needs to be more than just notes on a pad on my desk. It needs to be in a process where you and other people can actually make it happen. Then you get into ideas of repositories like Dropbox and other ways of sharing, SVN if you're using Unity, other methodologies for Unreal development. But these are all, best practices and setup. This has everything to do with your game and absolutely nothing to do with your game. Where it matters is that you will not be able to make your game beyond an idea without these structures. That's where it matters, But you can think your game and you can make a paper version of it. You can enjoy it with your friends. But if you really want to get it out there and, potentially build an audience, build a genre, or build a franchise, build a revenue stream, then production spine, management process, communication process, and timelines. Your budgets are going to come from that if you need budget. If you're going to ask people to commit to you for a share in whatever the success is, where you don't have money right now, definitely needs to be concise. You see, I only need 10 hours of your time a week. I need 20 of your hours of your time a week. I need all of your time a week. Very important to have that because people burn out or they'll get bored if you're not engaging enough in your development team, if you're not giving enough guidance. And also if you don't, as a group, make decisions, this is what we're making, you're going to spend most of your development time arguing about what the game should be and never actually make it. And that's something that, even rock bands and jazz bands know this. Making music. If you're not making music, you only say, well, who's the lead singer? Who's the lead bass? Who's this? You start talking about the politics of it rather than what is the product. And that's something you don't want to let happen, especially when you only have 2 or 3 guys. But it's even more chaotic if you have 1,000, if you're trying to drive them to a goal. So anyway, best practices, very much available to you, but based on at least my example is a production schedule spine, a production methodology in terms of management and communication. And then, as I said, all of this relates to goal setting and final product. You have to set those goals. You have to attain those goals because you don't want to take 5 years to make a product because it's only you. The market changes so much from quarter that you will make something no one will be interested in on a technology that doesn't exist anymore. So always keeping clear, defined goals. I have 3 months to make a game. Well, I don't want to make Elder Scrolls. Will I be able to make a whole game in 3 months? You have to evaluate that. If I can't, what can I make in 3 months? Because that's all I have. And making that hard decision that, okay, I have to wait till I have 6 months because in 3 months I can't. But in this 3 months, I'm going to get, based on this pipeline, all those elements I need for the full 6 month. So that I'll spend this 3 months, I'll go work, my friend will be on vacation again 2 months from now. So we'll finish out the other 3 months, all again, based on that plan, that spine, and that process. You can do those things. You can. So I think that's my answer, is that, these best practices are actually, they're not options. They're requirements to success.
This session was supposed to be an hour, 30 minutes. We're almost done with it. So Any other advice you would like to give us, you'd like to share with our community down here, our indie community, who trying to learn the ropes of the industry? Can you share anything from your years of experience?
Yes. Yeah, the main thing that I would say is to understand you're not just building a game, you're building the franchise, the business, the potential. So at that point, you have responsibilities. And as someone who is going to develop this franchise, this business, you have to make sure, based on best practices, research, analysis of research, definition of task, definition of goals. These are very important to the process. The thing also to remember is you're not alone. There are tens of thousands of game developers across the planet, and we talk to each other. We're organized, easily found. When you look at either organizations like various game developer associations, they will tell you what game companies are. Then you go into something like LinkedIn and you search for that game company. You can see people who are at that game company and their job task. You can go to virtual conferences like this, go to XDS virtual conference, GDC virtual conference, and try to have active dialogue. But you also have the ability through social networking to approach developers, established people, and say, I'm a developer, I'm trying to build this game, I'm doing these things. And in most cases, I won't say in all cases, in most cases, they will respond. They may not give you all the information you need, but they may say, I'm not really the guy to talk to. Joe's the guy to talk to. I'll make an introduction to Joe for you. Networking is very important. It's as important as the research, because when you look at the examples that I gave, that was written and compiled from hundreds, if not thousands of people. So if you can't get to the book, you can get to the people. And at that point, you can get the research done, you can get the networking done. They may also give you, like I've found over my career, find you connections you didn't even know about, or find you information you didn't know existed, help you refine your choices, give you an introduction to, Coke Media or somebody in Europe who actually publishes, who would be interested in your concept, where they may fund it. They may like that. That leads to making sure everything's under NDA. If you're protecting your ideas and your franchise, there are professional practices in order to talk to a publisher or to other people. They don't steal your ideas, if possible. It's not like you're going to be positioned to sue them unless you're a big corporation. But best practices run from, defining your goal, managing and producing your goal, but protecting and defending your goal. It's very important stuff. And I would recommend a little more research, a little more networking, a little more questioning, but definitely jump into it. Jump into it. Just don't go swimming before you know how to swim. Don't go into shark-infested waters unless you have the right weapons, So that would be my final comment, is that as a game development process, been doing it for over 30 years, planning on doing it even after I pass away. Hoping some of the things I build will actually have a life after I'm gone. I know a friend of mine who passed away that I'm working on, hopefully his legacy product that will continue to bring joy and gameplay to the audience, for several years at least after he has passed. It's a great place to be, making games and making products, especially in as crazy a world as we have, how chaotic it is, giving people a point of contact. There's so many game players that are connected globally, that are all about the game, but they also influence and communicate with each other about life and the goals that we have as a society. So, definitely anyone interested in this, Benedict has my contact. I think you've shared my contact points. So that's one point of contact in your network. Now you just have to build that up to a couple of hundred, couple of thousand. And definitely when you're making your product, the more that you have connections to people that have gone through production, maybe not the same kind of game, but anyone who's gone through it can help greatly in terms of their experience and information. Sorry about that call.
No problem.
Interrupting my final great words.
No problem. Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome.
This has been a learning experience for me. I'm sure it's very, very helpful for our community down here. Hopefully in future we get to do a second runner to this with more industry leaders and a larger audience than we have. All right.
Yes.
So
Sounds good.
great.
Okay.
All
Take
right.
care.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much
Okay.
once more. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Oh.